This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, and I think I was supposed to be here in person for the conference, and of course, with COVID, that didn't happen. So I do apologize for that, and again, apologies for starting a bit late because of the tech challenges. So I'll speak today for about 30 minutes, and we'll leave some time for questions and answers. And my email is at the end as well. So if anyone has any other questions, comments, concerns, feel free to email me afterwards. And I'm always happy to have a conversation about smart cities. So what I'm going to talk about today, of course, is smart cities, but smart city technology in rural and remote areas. So myself and a couple of colleagues have been working in the smart city research space for a couple of years now. We've looked at a number of different areas. Equity, procurement, smart city technology itself, governance issues, data governance, which I'm going to talk about a bit as well today. But one thing we've been quite interested in is extending the concept of smart cities to rural areas and examining how rural and remote communities have been adopting or not adopting smart city technology. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So first is, of course, a quick word about smart cities themselves. Smart cities really have their roots in the smart urbanism movement. So I think about smart urbanism, progressive urbanism, and it was really kind of about making cities more livable, more green, making them sort of more resource intensive. And over time, technology became more and more central to that process, right? So if you're going to make a community greener, and we're going to use resources better, technology is one tool to really help that process along and to help people understand their resource use better and to perhaps nudge them into making different choices about using resources. But over time, technology became more and more central to that process. So a couple of definitions up here on the screen. You can see things like smart computing technology, electronic governance, ICTs, Internet of Things, and of course, the more recent definitions tend to include things about public-private partnerships. Right. The thing to really kind of take away here, of course, is that when we're talking about smart cities, we're really talking about technology-enabled cities. So technology is at the core of the definition here. And of course, with everything that we get with technology, we get a sort of healthy dose of utopianism as well, right? So when we hear about smart cities, we tend to always hear about how they're going to make our lives better, how they're going to help save the world, they're going to transform your life, they're going to change the world. And these, of course, are pretty lofty expectations, right? It's probably safe to say that smart cities will never reach that bar, but for the most part, we've been under the impression that technology is going to save us from a lot of these different urban challenges that have been persistent throughout the years. And you couple this with a lot of different city ranking initiatives. Everybody wants to be the smartest city in the world. If you can't be the smartest, you want to at least be smart. Because the opposite of that, of course, is to be a dumb city. Nobody wants to be a dumb city. So we all want to be smart. And because of that, we've tended to adopt technology at a pretty rapid pace. In some cases, we haven't properly thought through what we really want to do with that technology, but we have, of course, rushed into adopting a lot of it. Those who work in rural and remote places know that you can't simply rush into spending a lot of resources. Everything has to be done in a very strategic way. So we haven't seen a lot of this, but we have seen some of this when it comes to rural communities. But when we're talking about smart cities, we tend to really always focus on cities, right? City is right there in the name, right? Smart city. And there's a couple of reasons for this. So the first is that an urban focus taints our policy lens throughout everything we do, really. So the focus always seems to be on large cities, right? Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto, etc. I mentioned here there's scale-dependent sales that are at play here as well, right? So technology vendors are really driving the smart city marketplace, and large management firms like McKinsey tend to be in the marketplace for selling smart city plans, right? So the big tech firms, Cisco and IBM, tend to kind of drive the marketplace along with the McKinseys of the world, and they always seem to tend to focus on larger sales, right? Larger contracts, stuff like that. So you can sell more in urban areas. They tend to drive the marketplace. So we tend to focus on cities more. And of course, we also tend to focus on larger smart city projects, right? So here on the slide, we have Selangor up at the top, and on the bottom is Mazda in the Middle East. But we've also seen a lot of large smart city projects right here in Canada. Quayside in Toronto is probably the largest of them. But these always tend to be in large urban areas. So as a result, this sort of tends to give us a sort of urban focus as well when it comes to smart cities. A couple colleagues and I have set out to examine what this process looks like outside of cities. And this is one of the papers that we recently did on this. But we, of course, have done a few other case studies as well. And so what we're going to be talking about today is kind of a culmination of some of that research with a little more of a practical focus given the audience. But in this particular paper, we looked at the Eye Valley in Nova Scotia and the Iqaluit. So two very different places that have, they're both obviously off the sort of urban path, but have adopted smart city technology for very different reasons. And so we'll get into some of that today. So what I want to do today is kind of threefold. First, I want to broaden our definition of a smart community. We're talking about smart towns, smart villages, move away from the sort of smart city ethos a bit, and talk about why a rural or remote community may want to actually adopt smart city technology. What's really in it for them? Of course, how do you get started? So I want to talk about strategies for adoption and development of smart city technology at scale. And then finally, I want to talk about some capacity and limitation challenges, mostly around data and data governance, especially the collection, use, and storage of data is becoming something that I think municipalities of all sizes need to begin to wrap their heads around a bit. So with that said, that's our plan of attack today. But let's begin by talking a little bit about smart communities. So for different case studies, we found there's a number of different reasons why rural communities would want to adopt smart city technology. The first, of course, is to overcome what we call the digital divide. I think it's something that we have heard about a lot. And we tend to sort of focus on broadband access when it comes to this, right? So everything from conducting work at home to accessing Netflix is harder if you don't have comprehensive broadband. So I think most of us who have come from a rural area understand this well. And what we've found, of course, is that broadband is part of the overall smart city technology adoption process. But a lot of smaller areas tend to wrap it up as part of the process, not as a starting point, right? So as opposed to sort of getting broadband first, the sort of notion is that if we're going to enter into a comprehensive long-term plan, often with some sort of private partner, broadband is going to be part of that, part of the overarching plan, as opposed to something that we do first, right? So the strategic adoption of smart city technology is often designed to overcome this digital divide that we often see. Second is to preserve a way of life. And I think that there's often been this sort of long-standing notion that there's a different rural culture, a different remote culture, that disruption to that is seen as quite a negative force. So technology used to be seen as somewhat of a disruption to that, especially in northern communities. In the indigenous communities that we visited for this research, we were told that the culture and the way of life is very much tied to land, right? So having young people leave for new opportunities and leaving the land creates much more of a disruption, right? So it creates a divide between yourself and your culture and your way of life. So adopting technology and adopting smart city planning tools was seen as one way to incentivize and motivate young people to stay within the community, which is seen as a way of preserving their way of life, right? So it's sort of a long-term game about preservation of culture, with which technology is one aspect of that. Third, of course, is to create local opportunities, right? So in remote areas, we found a lot of places where the library service was going digital, and it was huge investments, and not just in digital holdings and offerings in terms of books and magazines and different content, but also in different learning tools. So we've seen a number of places where they've adopted coding strategies, right? So that young people can learn coding, and as part of their sort of overarching smart city plan. And this is a way to sort of to sort of keep people learning locally, but also that they've been finding that a lot of these early coding lessons have turned into sort of app creation, and even businesses and small local tech firms, right? So smart city planning tends to be connected to opportunities for young people, but also for local businesses and things of that nature. Fourth, we've seen a big incentive here is to create some connection to urban services, mostly within the health sector, right? So if you're in a remote community in northern Canada, your smart city plan will probably revolve around healthcare to some degree, and getting remote access for remote surgery or for consultations with doctors who are further south in larger cities. And of course, growth and development, mostly economic development, right? So how do we create the conditions for businesses to relocate? I think now there's been kind of push more on remote work, and so there's been sort of a decoupling of certain firms and cities, and there's more of an opportunity now for rural and remote areas. So the reality here is that there's very likely more need to adopt smart city planning tools and smart city technology in rural and remote areas than there really is in urban areas. But the opportunity seems to flourish within urban areas. So we can change that a bit. So how to go about this? So one of the big questions that we were asking a lot of these different towns and villages that we were visiting and talking about smart city planning is that, there's a couple of different avenues here that really need to be addressed if you're going to create a larger smart city plan in rural and remote Canada. The first is that cooperation is key. Cooperation is sometimes not a fully natural concept for some municipalities, given that geography is a key factor in that. So, for instance, if you wanted to share the capital cost of a roadway, a bridge, or a recreation center, for the most part, that really centers on geography, right? So you both have to be located nearby to share the benefits of a joint recreation complex or joint skating rink or something along those lines. If you have a broad smart city strategy and you're looking at sort of ICTs and broadband access perhaps, that can be spread over a larger geographic area. So what we've seen is that cooperation comes a little more naturally within the smart city space, given that the benefits can be drawn over a much larger geographic area. Second here, of course, is to build from community need. And there's a lot of technology vendors out there who will try to sell a kind of purpose-driven smart city product or a smart city strategy to a town or village that doesn't necessarily need it. So we heard a lot about smart city traffic planning, right? So smart intersections. And these were designed to sort of gather data about usage and usage about points in time and day. And the whole idea was to better manage intersections. And essentially this technology would reduce waiting times. And so it would reduce congestion, but also reduce emissions. So as soon as green technology, it's just pitched to a number of small to mid-sized places. And a lot of the ones who were on the smaller side said, well, this is fantastic technology. We have one intersection and we don't have a traffic light on it. So it's not an issue to us, right? So, but with that said, so there's a lot of technology out there that is smart city technology certainly, but isn't necessarily needed in small and rural Canada because it doesn't solve a particular community problem or particular community need. So the sort of key is to sort of figure out what problem is facing your particular community and then building out from that and saying, is technology the right fix here? Technology isn't necessarily always the right fix, but is it one tool? Is it the right fix? Can we solve this problem with technology as opposed to a number of different other tools that we may have had in place, right? And then third is to develop an inclusive engagement focus, right? So to figure out what community need is, oftentimes you need to do consultation. I think all of us who are planners or work in government to some degree already know this. You have to consult. You have to consult in a kind of a different way when it comes to smart city technology, because there has to be a bit of a learning process involved with that as well, right? Because not everybody understands the reason why technology is being adopted. So there's a learning component that has to be done. It has to be a kind of a broader engagement process that we've seen a lot of places use digital engagement tools, so like a survey or something along those lines that's online. And the whole idea there is that if we're introducing a digital product, we need to essentially use a digital consultation tool. That's not necessarily the case. In fact, it's more important to use non-technology tools to sort of think about how you use technology within a smart city framework. But we did a survey a couple of years ago, and we surveyed 3 groups, and we asked the exact same question. So we surveyed politicians, staff, and the public, and we asked them the exact same questions, mainly about what technology do you not have, what technology do you want, and basically laid out a number of different smart city tools that are commonly adopted, and we found a huge gulf between what staff and politicians wanted and what the public wanted. And the goals of the public are usually a lot more modest, right? Politicians tend to be focused on larger legacy building projects, right? ICT hubs, innovation centers, stuff like this, right? Well, the public was kind of focused on, well, I'd love to be able to pay my taxes online, right? I wouldn't mind a municipal app in which I could, find out which day garbage day is, right, or something like that, or like which hours the local rec complex is open for, right? So their goals were really all about sort of digital government and digital service transformation, right? So there was a bit of a goal. So figuring out what your public really wants is a huge part of this, right? And in some cases, the goals are pretty modest, and they probably don't need large technology vendors to really fulfill them. Some of the solutions are found within government itself locally. So this is something to sort of keep in mind. I also want to talk about data. So I think a lot of us, when we think about data in smart cities, we think of data kind of as the fuel. I think that's the right way to sort of conceive the relationship between data and smart city technology. So if you're using one of those smart intersection, smart roadway management softwares, of course, you need a constant stream of data to have it work properly, right? So to understand a smart intersection, you need to know who's there constantly, and then you can use machine learning to sort of build out patterns of use, and you can manage the intersection better, right? So data is the fuel, and we also kind of think of data as kind of this emission, it's kind of like emissions as well, right? So it goes through the machine, it kind of goes up in the air, right? That it's sort of a byproduct, right? And it's almost it's troublesome thinking, right? Because data is really about a commodity that can be used and monetized, if not utilized properly. So it's not a simple byproduct that can be sort of floated up and disappear. It can be collected, and it can be used for good or for not so good. So I want to talk a little bit about that today, because I think that it's something that we need to consider when we are adopting smart city plans, because data is hugely important to this. So just a couple of examples here in the slides, right? So a couple of different technologies here. Smart waste bins becoming more and more popular, and here, of course, we can use smart technology to monitor resource levels as opposed to having maintenance workers drive around in trucks all day looking for overflowing garbage cans. The garbage cans can tell them when they're almost full. You can build a GPS route for them, and it manages their time more efficiently and make sure you don't have garbage kind of lining up all over the place, right? Sensors and roads, of course, can manage traffic. We have road noise sensors up top, and of course we have charging benches below. These are quite popular out here in Ontario. So the issue with a lot of this is that while the data from these tools gives us, some pretty powerful planning intelligence, especially when it comes to things like traffic management, traffic levels, stuff like that. It's also recording a lot of data from the vehicles themselves, and there's been cases where we've seen that the sensors are actually picking up vehicle information and information about people who are traveling in the vehicles, right? So the noise detectors, of course, are also picking up conversations, right, and not just road noise. And one of the challenges with this SUFA bench, which is somewhat popular out here in Ontario, is that when you plug into the bench to charge your phone, it was taking information off your phone, right? So it's taking data from your phone itself, and some of it, of course, was emails, texts, and personal data, right? All of this, of course, can be commercialized. And so SUFA was providing benches like this for free. And, for a lot of communities, this seemed fantastic. It also gave you a lot of information about use within parks. And so you could say, well, now we can monitor foot traffic within parks, and the bench is free, so that's great, right? But a lot of this kind of harkens back to the new economic model when it comes to data and infrastructure, right? So the SUFA benches are really this sort of new economic thinking, which really sees data as a commodity in and of itself. So the physical piece of infrastructure doesn't really matter as much as it used to, right? Because it's the data that's the actual commodity. So we can contrast this with Highway 407. So I know that a lot of you, of course, aren't from Ontario, but Highway 407 is an electronic toll route that sort of stretches around the sort of exterior of the Greater Toronto area. Most of our major freeways here are, of course, congested. They're jammed. A lot of people around here in the GTA, and for some reason we all want to drive. So this highway was meant to bypass some of that. And if you want to use it, you have to pay a toll. And so if you drive through most of the northern U.S., you find toll roads and toll highways virtually everywhere, right? Of course, you're stopping at a toll booth and you're throwing some coins in or whatever, right? With the 407, it uses a transponder to track how far you've actually driven on the highway, or it picks up your license plate number, cross-references that with Ministry of Transportation data, and then it prepares a bill for the owner. So it uses data, but it uses it in a way to charge you for consumption of a public infrastructure project, right? So this is kind of an old economic model where we're using data as a means to an end, where the new economic model is really seeing the data as an end in and of itself. So the data essentially becomes the commodity. So what do we need to know about this? And well, essentially, as I mentioned, the data is valuable. So private firms, of course, have more of an interest in engaging in data-centric infrastructure projects because there's money to be made off the data itself. Not really thinking of data as the byproduct, but data as the main source to make money off of this particular project. Data also has a dual use as a form of regulatory power. So what I mean by that is that it puts a lot of really important, powerful data into private hands as opposed to public ones. So if you think of a company like Airbnb, they have a pretty good handle on all of the commercial lodging establishments within any city. So here in Toronto, Airbnb knows where every commercial lodging establishment is because there's a lot of them that work exclusively on their platform. the city necessarily doesn't, right? There was a time when the city knew every hotel, motel, B&B, anything like that, right? But they don't necessarily know where all the Airbnb locations are. They do now because there's a regulation in place. But without that, Airbnb had a lot of information that bypassed our traditional understanding about lodgings, and which which kind of harkens back to our zoning ability and regulatory strategy and stuff like that. Because now we had commercial lodging establishments in residential areas, right? So there's a lot of powerful data that the city didn't at one time have any control over. So if we create the regulatory conditions to control that data, then we regain some of that regulatory power, right? So what I would urge there is that we understand the role of data within public infrastructure projects, and that we plan accordingly. So what I mean by that is that we have the knowledge and the ability to properly regulate, and the understanding that virtually every public infrastructure project has some sort of data component, and that the data that's being taken and collected is essentially us, right? It's data about the public, and some of this is sometimes sensitive. So government has some role here to regulate how that data is collected and used. And part of that has to do with aligning our regulatory strategy, but also our procurement strategy going forward, right? And the one thing I would also add is that Canada doesn't have a national data plan. We don't really have a national data strategy in place, which makes us somewhat of an outlier within the international stage, right? We need something like this. So right now, the sort of heavy regulatory work on the data front falls to municipalities themselves. And what we should be doing is trying to refocus that a bit and to create national data standards that some of these larger technology vendors should be essentially meeting, right? That shouldn't be up to individual municipal governments. There should be some national standards in place that we could apply to individual public infrastructure projects that are incorporating data. Just the final words. See, I'm getting close to my time here, and I want to, of course, turn it over to you for any questions or comments. But one comment here on data for good. Right. So when we talk about data collection in some of these smart city projects, we're talking about surveillance, and surveillance isn't necessarily always a bad thing, right? We can use data from these projects as a powerful tool to help shape our communities, right? That we can use this as another planning tool to figure out essentially use patterns, right? And with that said, we need an evaluative framework in place to be able to evaluate the worth of some of these projects, especially as they are driven, as they're largely driven by private companies, right? So figuring out how we can adjust our procurement strategy and our RFPs to incorporate data governance is probably going to be key here, right? That data collection in of itself isn't bad. It's what happens to that data after it's collected. So ensuring that it remains in public hands is something that I think is challenging, but very important, right? The figuring out that as long as we have the ability to collect and regulate data and use it to enhance shape, when we lose control of that and is commercialized in some cases in somewhat nefarious ways, that's not so good. So we need to figure out a way to increase the social and economic benefits for the public when it comes to the use and creation of data-intensive public infrastructure projects. So with that said, I think I've met my time and kind of gone over it a bit. Again, I'm sorry for those early technology troubles there, my sort of early tech bumbling. Sorry about that, but with that, I'll turn it over to you if there are any questions, comments, concerns. I'm more than happy to answer anything you have. And again, thank you very much for having me here today.
Thank you, Zach. So again, I'm gonna do some of the moderating for you.
Awesome, thank you.
And so the way we usually do this, if anyone has some questions, I think the easiest way, just unmute yourself. I'll see you go green and call on you. Sound good? Just gonna open things up. Oh, we have a baby asking a question too here, so on my end.
Not sure if anyone heard, but mine is upstairs running around right now. So apologies if you if you heard my son today.
That's part of COVID, unfortunately. Colleen, you're up.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Colleen O'Neill. I'm the project manager for the Energize Bridgewater project in Nova Scotia, Bridgewater, Nova Scotia. I'm going to ask the first COVID question, I suppose. A lot of these projects, it seems to me, you covered that community engagement is an enormous component. What are some ways to do that during a global pandemic?
Sorry, to do what? Sorry, I kind of
to do community engagement that's meaningful. Do you think the model has changed with COVID, or is there any guidance that you can provide on that point?
Yeah, certainly. Sorry about that. I kind of missed part of it, so thank you for clarifying. Certainly. So our ability to sort of open up the library or the rec center and bring people in and have kind of face-to-face conversation is limited right now. I don't know what the COVID guidelines are in Nova Scotia right now in terms of gathering, but here for most of Ontario, it's between 10 and 50. We're in different stages. But with that said, a lot of people just aren't going to feel comfortable going to a open hall and talking with people for a couple of hours, right? So we need to figure out ways to sort of overcome some of that. So the ways that we've seen this happening here in Ontario, at least, have been platforms like Microsoft Teams, GoToMeeting, Zoom, but using a call-in component as well, right? So to do a virtual presentation, we do something much like this, but where the distinction comes in is there has to be some way to phone in as well. If the project's long-term, I've seen some places use mail-out surveys and also phone lines that you can call and you can leave a message, right? So I think it's being kind of somewhat adaptable, right? And it sucks right now, of course, because we can't get together. I always think the best way is, opening up a hall and talking about some of these things. I think with smart city projects, there's a bit of learning that has to happen with this as well. So that's tough to do, with a teletown hall or something like that. But until we're sort of in a place where people are comfortable returning to open meetings and open halls, stuff like that, that's probably the best that we can do. I would say try to be always accessible as possible. So video plus telephone. If you have the time, mail out surveys. If you have the money, sort of postal walk things, of course. But there's a number of different strategies, but all of it kind of depends on timing. So I don't know if that's helpful. I think you probably have done some of these already, I'm guessing. But anyway, I hope that's helpful. Thanks for the question. I appreciate it.
Okay, if we have anyone else with questions, just turn your mic on and we'll give you the floor. Louis Pope, you're up.
Good afternoon. I have a quick question regarding introductions into these smart city techniques. I know that you referenced the solar benches and items like that, but some of these communities might not have the available funding or the connections to the partnerships like you might see in places like Ontario. Mm-hmm. What are some of the introductory steps that these rural communities of potentially less than 1,000 people can take to really start off and jump into that the pool of technology, so to speak?
Yeah. So the techniques that we've seen is mostly about figuring out what needs to happen first. I think that being off the beaten path is somewhat helpful. I think that large urban centers are somewhat bombarded with different smart city technology vendors coming at them and offering them different things. And I think that they sometimes stumble when they adopt things a little too quickly, right? So the SUFA bench issue is something that was kind of offered up, and it was, hey, free benches and charging stations, and we give you data about in like parks. And everyone's like, okay, great, win-win. Because it was sort of offered up so easily, it was adopted system, right? There wasn't a lot of time to critically assess it. So with that said, there is a benefit to being off the beaten path, having opportunities tossed at you like that, right? So what we've seen from a lot of places that are about 1,000 or less is that it's more of a long-term game where you sit down and you think about what's the need that we're really solving, right? So if we want, electronic waste bins, or we want, sort of broad ICT adoption strategy or plan or something like that, you start off with figuring out what you want, and then it usually goes out with like a normal RFP process, right? There's often a lot of smaller tech firms that are kind of getting up and running who are willing to look at smaller projects. But with that said, I mean, Cisco's, the IBMs, they're still out there, and they are, they're actively bidding on projects that are put out there. But with that said, I think that there's some interesting ways that you can partner with upstart technology firms. So just one example here from Ontario, Belleville, Ontario, city of it's 50,000, so not 1,000 or less, or not a small place by any means, certainly not a large city. They were approached by a company called Paladin. Paladin makes GPS systems for buses, so it's like a on-demand bus system, so like an Uber but for a bus. And so what it does is that you can download the app and you can get the bus to pick you up wherever, and the system optimizes the route for the driver and just tells the driver where to go. So you put in where you want to get picked up from and where you want to get dropped off, and it optimizes the bus system, and they pulled up all the bus stops, right? So it's basically a on-demand bus, and the technology optimizes the route to get you there at this, at a pretty decent pace, right? They were offered that through a partnership, right? And because they needed a place to test this technology, right? So there are opportunities like that I think are out there as well. And I think part of it is sort of creating your plan, but also putting the flag up and letting people know that you want to do something cool. So you have the RFP process, but I think it's also about kind of keeping your ear to the ground, seeing what's happening at some of the large universities, happening at the tech incubators, the startups, stuff like that, right? So I think it's kind of ingraining yourself within that particular world as well. But the RFP process, you will get nibbles that way too. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you.
Okay, let's open things back up again. Jordan, you're up.
Hi, thank you. I'm a student at Dalhousie, and I was wondering about, I appreciated your talk, and I particularly like that you mentioned the Quayside Sidewalk Labs project. I was wondering if you could elaborate on any sort of lessons that rural municipalities can learn from particularly the troubles and complications that Toronto had with the Digital Sidewalk Labs project.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. So Sidewalk Labs has obviously left the scene, and part of it is because they had some pretty significant challenges overcoming some of the hesitancy about data governance and privacy and things like that, right? So I think the main thing to sort of take away is that the procurement process for Sidewalk Labs wasn't thought out properly. So let's just kind of back up a bit. Waterfront Toronto, which is kind of peculiar tri-level agency, put out a call for an innovation partner, right? They wanted to develop part of Toronto's waterfront, right? And they weren't looking for condos or anything like that. But they're looking for condos with technology, right? So they put out a RFP with a thumb on the scale for Google, which is essentially the parent company of Sidewalk Labs, which is owned by Alphabet, right? And so from that point, they accepted Sidewalk Labs as the winning bid, and then the plan was to work with them to create standards to govern data, right? So you were setting them up as the regulator as well in this particular case, which is something that I don't think we would do for any other procurement area, right? We wouldn't let a private company self-govern like that, especially when they're collecting mass amounts of data. They won the bid without any sort of privacy plan, and without any real sort of concrete plan about what the goals of the project were. The whole idea was that now that you are the winning bidder, we're going to engage in a year-long filling out process, and you're going to show us what the renderings look like, and then also how you're going to do the tech and everything else. I think that that's only one way to go about it, but the way that they did it, they didn't really figure out what they wanted first, right? They wanted cool things, cool tech, and they allowed themselves to be sort of consumed by one of the world's largest data firms. And as a tri-level agency that's tasked with developing the waterfront, they were out of their leagues a bit in regulating a company like Google. So how I think that probably should have run is that before you started the process, really sort of sit down and think about how data is going to be collected, how it's going to be stored, right? And to sort of make the rules ahead of time and say, if you want this project, if you want to win, you're going to govern yourself by the standards that we set out. So to set it out ahead of time, right? And I think that's what municipalities, large and small, are somewhat missing with smart city technology, right? We almost always need some sort of private partner for this. And so I think the sort of key here, the key takeaway is really set the standards yourself and then make companies meet it, right? As opposed to being permissive and open with these firms and thinking that you can really work with them, right? I think Waterfront Toronto really thought that they could work with Sidewalk Labs to make a project that worked in the public interest. When Sidewalk Labs they'd never built condos before. They're not a land development company. They're a data company, right? So why would they be interested in anything but the commercialization of data, right? So I think that we need to not be so so taken by some of these large companies, right? Toronto was very much taken back by the notion that Google had picked us, right? That we were selected by Google. Isn't this fantastic? This is wonderful. When really we should have been the ones setting the standards. So I think it's make the plan first, set the standards, make private companies meet it, as opposed to the other way around.
Okay, folks, anybody else online? 10 minutes left if anyone's interested. Going once. Going twice.
Chat. Corey from Open North, the Open Community Solutions Network, is providing training and smart city training approaches restarting in August. It will be open across Canada for municipal staff. So it's a helpful tip from Corey in the comments there.
Cool, thank you. Oh, we've got Corey. Oh, do you want to say something, Corey?
Yeah, would you like me to add to that at all?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, for the folks who are unfamiliar, I know some people on the call participated in our program last year. We work exclusively or almost exclusively with small and medium-sized communities on smart city topics. You can find information about it on the Evergreen website. We worked with Bridgewater, who's also on the call. And yeah, I just wanted to say that the official launch hasn't been made yet, but the service will be available in August. And we really encourage folks, especially from Atlantic Canada, to reach out to us. Even if you're just looking to learn more about smart city approaches, we provide support on that kind of thing. Not just for those who are looking at spending multiple millions of dollars, but even everyone who's just curious. So feel free to drop me a line or reach out to Evergreen. Thanks.
That's awesome. Open North does fantastic work, so that's a great offer there.
All right, any more questions for Zach before we say goodbye for the afternoon? Okay, seeing none. Thank you so much, Zach. That's fantastic. We definitely had to change around not only our planned conference, but obviously our day-to-day professional development. So it's fantastic to have you come along and help us out. And it's fantastic to see so many people on here. We had well over 40 at one point, and I think that speaks to the needs of rural communities in lots of different ways. They're interested in this stuff and they want to get involved. So thank you so much for your time.
Awesome, thank you. And again, apologies for some of those early tech challenges. And thanks again, and take care, everyone.
Take care.